I actually found out something that was kind of amusing for me to stumble across. Today, I happen to get Fridays are generally my days off as of late. It was kind of funny. There was somebody who left on one of my video comments not too long ago. He said, "Why don't you get a job and go to work?" I do work. I work anywhere from 60 to 70 hours a week. But I did find this morning when I was kind of getting an idea for a topic about Bill W.'s earlier years, because oftentimes in AA we're told what a genius he was and how brilliant he was, and oftentimes I there was one particular old timer that would always bring up Ebby going to see Bill and how this whole thing was a miracle and a gift from God and all that other kind of stuff. Uh, but there's a line in there that I had never really paid much attention to, and as I was kind of browsing through homage papers and browsing through a couple of news articles, I did find this interesting little tidbit of information that was talking about how terrible of a student that Bill W. was in both high school and literally couldn't get into MIT, even though in the big book in the story where him and Ebby meet one another, there's a little line about I'm a man of science and I went to MIT and I knew all these things and I thought God was man and man only, and he talks about this icy intellectual mountain that just melted when Ebby said to him, why don't you choose your own God? The funny part about all of this is Ebby relapsed and Bill W. more or less kind of kicked him to the curb and forgot all about him once he had Bob to mooch off of. But there is something before I get into the real crux of this video that I found from it's Bill W. My first 40 years. It's his own freaking words, and tell me if this does not sound like classic old timer shit that you used to hear in those meetings. He was terrible in algebra. I can't really blame him too harshly for that. I had a hard time with all that stuff in high school. Mathematics was never really my strong point. Anything literary or anything related to books or anything related to history or something like that, I was usually pretty good at. But when it come to math, I never did really like it very much. But I'm not faulting him for being bad at math. I'm not faulting him for that, but I'm faulting him for the story he told about his struggle with math in school. And this comes from pages 36 and 37 out of Bill W., My First 40 Years. Tell me if this doesn't sound like the familiar type of narrative that you hear oftentimes in AA meetings. He writes this, "Well, as I've said before," this is Bill W. writing this, "I always had great difficulty with algebra, and calculus required the memorizing of a lot of formulas, and I couldn't memorize them. And I'm not faulting him for that, mind you. I'm getting to the good part here. I realized that I was going to be an absolute flat failure in calculus. In fact, the professor promised that I would get a zero. As I just remarked, the basis of calculus rests in a tremendous mathematical invention. Leibniz and Newton both arrived at this advanced thinking and concept together. And the underlying theory and grasp of this thing is really a great abstraction and not a very easy one to lay hold of." This is Bill W. talking about calculus now. "And I began to sense, after I had plied the professor with a lot of questions, that he really had not laid hold in a deep sense the underlying principle of the whole damn business of calculus. In other words, he comes to wherever he was at this point. I think it says here he was at Norwich. He comes here. He admits he's terrible in algebra. He admits he's terrible in mathematics. Yet he knows more than the fucking professor, just like all these old timers with the stories, right? I would be the first one to admit, I even told math teachers before, look, it's not your fault. I'm not good at this kind of thing. I had to really hit the books in order to pass math tests. But I wouldn't have dreamed of going to a math class and telling the math teacher, I've asked you a lot of questions, but you just don't understand, do you? You don't understand mathematics. I understand mathematics, even though I suck at it. That's literally what he's saying here. But anyway, the professor was a catalog of formulas. He could apply the formulas, he was glib, but deep down he didn't know how the goddamn thing worked. And I made up my mind I would learn." Okay. So in other words, he's figured out that his math teacher doesn't have no idea how mathematics really works, and he's going to outthink the math teacher, right? Even though he admits he's so terrible in algebra that he's not going to be able to get the calculus. Now, I don't know how school worked back then. I know when I was in school, centuries ago. You had pre-algebra, and then you had algebra, then you had geometry, then you had algebra 2, and you had to do all of that before you could get all the way up to calculus. And I played pocket pool with most of that because in my teenage years I was interested in all the best grunge music that I could find on records and any other obscure band I could pick up on records. And I was interested in women, and I was interested in MTV, and I was interested in drinking. So yeah, calculus was not important to me. But I just think it's funny that he's admitting here in his own words that the teacher doesn't know anything, that he knows more than the teacher does. But anyway, and I'm getting to the crux of the video here. This is going to be about Ebby and Bill. So I went over to the library and I read the history of mathematics and all that led up to the evolution of the concept of calculus. And finally, for a few brief days, I did lay a hold of the concept so that I knew it. I had to study one time in another class much later on when I was in technical school, which, like I said, it's not worth the paper I was written on, but it was a very fascinating subject about the history of art. And there's a reason why I'm bringing this up. It started out with the earliest drawings of cavemen, in the Neolithic era, the Venus of Willendorf statue. I think I'm saying that correctly. For all my art classes, I can't say it correctly, right? It talks about the way art evolved from the way the ancient Egyptians, the way that they created in their sculptures, the type of thing that would have been important to them. It compared the art of the Mesopotamians. It went on into what little we know about the Etruscans, and it worked its way all the way up to the Renaissance era, and it worked its way all the way up past what was called Mannerism and several other things. But it was a fascinating class. It was one of my favorite classes that I actually took. I loved it. I loved it so much that I bought books about it, and bought books about a history on something not just to do with art, but a history of music and movements and everything from certain types of compositions and everything else. But I'm derailing myself on the topic here. This is not to brag about my art class. But my point is, there would have been no way for me to cover all that within a few days. Okay, the class itself was like 6 weeks long, and we had just barely scratched the surface of all the material there was left to cover from this period of time. And it was one of those situations where the more I read about it, the more I realized I didn't know anything about art whatsoever, and the more I read about different types of art movements and things like that, just like with music, I realized that there was literally libraries full of information about these two subjects that I barely knew anything about it. But Bill W. here would have us believe that he just went to the library, picked up a book on the history of mathematics, and knew how the whole entire thing worked within a few days. Doesn't work like that. It's I had a passing interest at one time to read everything I could about World War II, and I'm going to say it took me at least a year and a half before I felt like I could comfortably talk about everything to do with it, including everything from the League of Nations to the Versailles Treaty to the Versailles Treaty. I don't want to sound like Little Carmine on the Sopranos, Versailles, the Weimar Republic and all those other things. It took me about a year and a half before I felt like, I could probably talk to somebody about World War II with a good degree of confidence. But you're not going to figure out everything in a few fucking days here. Anyway, I've derailed, so I'm going to go back. By this time, I had developed considerable talent in argument in a few days, and I got the professor over a barrel, and I made a fool out of him in front of his entire class, and he gave me a 0. But I had won one battle. In other words, I was the only one on school grounds, the only guy in school, the number one man who deeply understood the underlying principles of calculus. You really expect me to believe that bullshit? I'm going to read from the Orange Papers here when he talks about this. He says, the part that I find funniest is how Bill W. alleges that he learned the entire deepest secrets of calculus in a few days, and he made his professor look like a fool, but he couldn't pass his exam. He still got a 0, but yet somehow or the other, he was the only man in school who understood how mathematics worked. Boy, if that's not a classical trademark old-timer story, I don't know what is. Bill Wilson seems to have deserved a 0 in psychology too, Orange Papers writes, if you're going to. Yeah, very much so, judging by the program he would go to start. He obviously never read something like, say, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Bill made no attempt to get along with mathematics professors. Bill didn't try to use his new knowledge to maybe work with the professor or sit down in front of the professor and say something like, hey, I think I've got kind of an understanding going on here about calculus. Maybe I should work on this with you, but could you guide me along here? Now, he just wanted to make him look like a fool. Also, notice how Bill W. tap danced from admitting he was a total failure to declaring that his mathematics professor was a total fool. Such behavior is typical symptom, not diagnosing here, of narcissistic personality disorder. They just can't stand being criticized. They hate whomever makes them look bad, so they deliberately lash out in violent, defiant counterattacks. He proudly brags that he's made the professor look bad, the professor who dared criticize him, that he's the number one man in school now, and that he's the only one in the fucking school that knows how it works. So, I'm going to shift a little bit here because Orange Papers does a few quotes from the DSM-V4, which is kind of out of date here, but I don't think it's relevant to this video I'm making because Bill W. did so poorly, Orange writes, at Norwich, that the commandant at Norwich wanted him to be expelled. Only the bandmasters insisted that he needed Bill, kept him from getting kicked out of school. Then World War I spared Bill from the shame of not being able to graduate because he was such a failure. He ended up enlisting in the army, but he never returned to college. Now, this is the crux of the thing. When Bill W. wrote his story of Alcoholics Anonymous, he tells a quite different story. One day in the fall of 1934, Ebby Thatcher, a fellow Burr and Burton alumnus, as well as an old drinking buddy and a hopeless alcoholic, shows up sober and eager to recruit Bill Wilson for the Oxford group. It wasn't AA, it was the Oxford group. Bill describes their conversation this way, and then I ask him, and this is in the fucking big book, what's this all about? You say that you aren't drinking, but you also say you aren't on the water wagon either. What's up? Well, Ebby said, I've got religion. What a crusher that was, Ebby and religion. Maybe his alcoholic insanity had become religious insanity. It was an awful letdown. I had been educated at a wonderful engineering college where somehow I had gathered the impression that man was God. Obviously, this isn't true at all, Orange writes. Bill W. was not educated at some wonderful engineering college. He flunked the MIT entrance exams and couldn't get in. The engineering college that he never attended never taught him that man was God. Likewise, even though Bill W. was never trained as a scientist or a professional or anything else, he describes his religious conversion like this. Ebby knew well my prejudices. He knew that my God was science, so carefully avoiding those aspects of the Oxford group approach that it disturbed me. He told his story. I want to interrupt here right now and say nobody has science as a God. Okay, if you ever hear somebody say, well, I put my faith in science, what they're generally saying is, I'm looking for the scientific answers to whatever the complex questions are to the universe around me, than I am looking towards matters of faith. Like for instance, if you were curious about maybe the possibilities of what causes earthquakes, and you talked to a seismologist, and the seismologist said, we can't 100% know where earthquakes come from. We can't 100%, not where they come from. We can't 100% know when, is what I meant to say, not what. We can't 100% know when an earthquake's going to happen. We can look at seismic activity. We can look at the activity that occurs near fault lines. We can maybe make some kind of probabilities about what could happen. We can observe how many earthquakes happened on this particular fault line at this single moment. Based upon, let's say, the last year in review. We're pretty confident of this. We're not so sure about that. We can't 100% predict if a big one's going to happen, if it's not going to happen. We're just monitoring, we're studying, we're learning what we can. That's not having faith in seismology. That's saying, okay, the top experts spend all their time studying earthquakes. They know what causes them. They know where the fault lines are. They know that so many do happen here. They know that sometimes in places like the state of Oklahoma, which didn't used to have that many earthquakes, and all this fracking started happening, and now they're having all these earthquakes. We do know these things based on what we can observe, but it's not a religion. It's not my faith is in the seismologist. If I'm worried about earthquakes, the seismologist is my God. That's not how it fucking works. It's just like these people that'll say, well, there has to be a God because you can't explain where something came from. Well, the correct answer is the same answer the seismologists give. We don't know for sure when another earthquake's going to happen. We can observe it. That's a hell of a lot more reasonable and rational than someone say, well, I know when the next earthquake will happen because it's God that'll decide it. Okay? These people seem to not understand how faith in science itself works. He demonstrates that right here. Anyway, to keep going. He recounted the simple principles Bill's talking about Ebby, upon which he was trying to work, especially emphasizing the idea that he had been hopeless. He told how he had got honest about himself and his defects, how he tried to practice a brand of giving that demanded no return for himself. That's a bunch of bullshit. Then very dangerously, he touched upon the subject of prayer and God. He frankly expected me to balk at these notions. This comes from Bill W., My First 40 Years, written by Bill W. Also note, Orange Papers writes, how Bill excused the Oxford group practice of deceptive recruiting, only telling the prospect what he would like to hear and save the ugly truths for later, after he's been changed into a committed member of the group. Up to a point, Ebby made plenty of sense. Confession and restitution might be difficult. The pace he'd set was certainly fast. But how was I to swallow this garbage, Bill W. writes. I had one of those modern educations and had learned that man is God, the spearhead of evolution. Once again, this is the same old fallacy that I've encountered lots of times from AA people. Oh, you think because you're smart, that you think you're God. No, nobody ever said that man was God. Nobody ever said that man is the spearhead of evolution. Evolution in every species as it is right now is as it is by evolution. There's no greater or less than. I mean, a cat has become a cat through thousands of centuries of through thousands of years of evolution, like a man has become a man. But there's no, I'm higher than the cat. I'm the spearhead of evolution because I'm a talking monkey with thumbs on my fingers, and therefore I'm way more intelligent than all the other four-legged creatures around me, or the primates that don't stand fully upright all the time. That's not how fucking evolution works. Anytime, by the way, I'm sidetracking again, anytime, by the way, you hear somebody say evolution and racism, they're full of shit. Those people are going by something called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the belief about evolution being about races that are higher than other races and species being higher than other species. But actual modern day scientific study of evolution doesn't prove that. We actually know that intelligent creatures like elephants and dolphins have such things as a sense of fairness and empathy here. Anyway, I don't mean to turn this into a fucking Discovery Channel video about science here. I'm talking about AA. Up to a point, okay, yeah, I read that already. Obviously, Bill had not had one of these modern educations, and Bill was not a scientist, Bill was not an atheist, not even an agnostic, because he keeps describing himself in these tall tales. He says in Bill W., My First 40 Years, I'd better find what my friend had found. Was I like the man who suffers with cancer who would do anything to get well? Well, the man who suffers with cancer is going to probably not put his faith in science, but he's going to look at what both the medical and everybody else, the experts, have to say about it. He's not going to say, well, you know what, I confessed all my sins and the cancer went foop like that and I don't have to worry about it any longer. Perhaps I wouldn't need an emotional conversion. After all, a conservative atheist like me ought to be able to get on with anything like that. A conservative atheist? He doesn't understand atheism. He doesn't understand any of this. He doesn't understand this. And if this was his understanding of atheism, then it was on the same brand as his understanding of calculus. I'm a failure at every fucking thing, but I made the professor look like a moron here. This guy is so fucking delusional. I can't believe I ever took his big book with any seriousness. And Bill W. writes in the big book of his conversion with Ebby, I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. My friend suggested that when what seemed a novel idea, he said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered in many years. He's acting like being an intellectual or being a learned man of science and mathematics makes you some miserable fucking prick that lives in shadows. I think we ought to ask all the evolutionary biologists, the seismologists, the astronomers, all the people who make their living in the field of science. Do you feel like you're living in the shadow? I bet you do feel like you're living in the fucking shadow. You know with your seismic measurements, and you know with your Richter scale, and you know with your observations of geology and all those other things, that you're just a shell of a man. You need to bow to the higher power. You feel strong with your telescope in the sky looking at the stars, but you're a man of pride. You need to accept God. I bet you most of them would not answer that in that manner. Bill W., Orange Papers writes, never had a problem with icy intellectualism. He wasn't an intellectual at all. And he didn't even get gentleman C's. He didn't even graduate. Bill W. excelled at baseball in school, not math, science, philosophy, or even theology. And Bill W. contradicted himself in his autobiography. After his failure in college, he enlisted in the Army, where his ROTC training at Norwich got him a lieutenant commission. In the summer of 1918, his unit assembled in Newport, Rhode Island, in preparation for being shipped to France in the war. Bill and his new wife Lois went to the seashore and watched the sunset together. Bill claimed that was when he actually had his first spiritual experience there. Wait a minute, the spiritual experience he had with Ebby is not where he had his first spiritual experience? Let's read about this. It was part of a shoreline where we were utterly alone, she and I, looking out over the ocean. He's talking about him and his wife. The sun was setting, and as the minutes passed, our gloom was superseded by a growing feeling of duty, patriotism. And we talked about these things, and then it turned into be, wow, he didn't know how to write either, an exaltation that I now realize amounted to genuine spiritual experience. In other words, we found the joy is sacrifice. We were given the strength and the joy to go on in the face of utter perilousness over the circumstances. That was the first outline and trace of spiritual experience as a mechanism, as it evolved in me over the years. Yeah. World War I was real spiritual. The horrors of trench warfare, mustard gas, entire people being not even given the adequate treatment for what they call shell shock. All the horrors of the Great War, World War I, the war that was supposed to be the war to end all wars. I'm sure all those people that were dying left and right in those trenches, and all those people that were being killed through the gas mask and all the shelling and all that other kind of stuff, I'm sure that was a real spiritual experience. Soon after Bill W.'s unit got sent overseas, they were detained in Winchester, England, because of a plague. While there, Bill visited Winchester Cathedral. And of course, he writes here about how he had a spiritual experience inside Winchester Cathedral. And I'm not going to read all of it because it's this long thing. But, I will read this part. The supernatural and the notion of God kept crossing my mind, and the sense of some sort of sustaining presence in that place was overpowering. I couldn't define it, but it was a valid spiritual experience. You notice how he claims it's a valid spiritual experience. He doesn't actually say, hey, it could have been just the wonder of looking at architecture that has been here for so many centuries, like I talked about in another video when I was looking at historical things like the harpsichord in the museum that had been around since the 1500s. No, it was a valid spiritual experience. It had classical mechanism, collapsed human powerlessness, then God coming to a man to lift him up, to set him on the high road to his destiny. Those were my impressions in the cathedral. Well, so much for Bill's claims of having received one of those modern educations that made him into an atheist. Bill claimed that his feelings at the seashore were genuine and valid, based on what standards? Whose standards? The Anglican churches? How and when and where did Bill W. get the training to be a judge of spiritual experiences, qualified to pronounce someone genuine and valid and some not? This could be another classic case, he's writing, of Bill W.'s narcissistic personality disorder symptoms, possibly. His feeling that he was qualified to lecture everybody else on everything from recovery to religion to spiritual experiences, even though he had zero training or zero education in those fields. And I want to add, he felt qualified to claim he could make a fool out of a calculus professor, even though he knew that he was a failure in mathematics. This Does sound a lot like the kind of old timer stuff that you hear in the meetings, does it not? And just what is collapsed human powerlessness? How does it differ from uncollapsed human powerlessness? Or even inflated human powerlessness? Obviously, Bill W. was just pontificating with meaningless, flowery language and talk about weasel words, though I was not a conscious believer in God at the time. Well, what's that supposed to mean? Was he an unconscious believer? Was his subconscious mind still believing while his unconscious mind wasn't? Was he an atheist or not? So he sort of half believed and half ignored, but got genuine spiritual experience. Okay. Bill W.'s statements in the opening pages of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous also contradict Bill's later stories of being an atheist at the time he met Ebby. I had always believed in a power greater than myself. You know, I hate that term, actually, power greater than yourself. Of course, there's things that are powers greater than ourselves. Everything from earthquakes, everything from tornadoes and cyclones and hurricanes and all sorts of, and volcanoes and other natural disasters. That doesn't mean power is greater than ourselves, or sentient, or aware, or interested in interfering in our everyday, ordinary lives down here. But then he says, I was not an atheist. Few people really are, for that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. Atheism's not a faith position. Is not believing in Santa Claus a faith position? Is saying I don't believe the Easter Bunny comes to my house, is that a faith position? Atheism is a lack of belief in a God. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. I don't believe a God made all this. There is no strange proposition that the universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. From the dominating models that we have, we pretty much have an idea, or I would guess you would call it a consensus about an expanding universe in the Big Bang model. I mean, I'm not a cosmologist. I'm not one of those people who can talk to you about something like abiogenesis, which is the origin of life on Earth. But at the same exact time, I've never met anybody that says, no, we're going nowhere. We're going nowhere at all. Well, according to Bill W. here, something that's worried about what alcoholics do, something that's worried about people's alcoholic self-centeredness, blew something from its hands and created a universe and said, the universe is going somewhere, we're not going nowhere here, we're going somewhere, the earth is going somewhere, yeah, it's going around the sun, My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists, suggested vast laws and forces at work. He doesn't understand a fucking thing about chemists, astronomers, or evolutionists. He doesn't understand anything. He's like he was in the fucking calculus class. The astronomers, the chemists, they don't call them evolutionists. Evolutionary biologists understand that there are vast laws and forces at work. They understand that through observation. They understand that through study. They understand that through valid evidence that presents itself in nature, okay? They don't just sit there and say, a few thousand years ago, a rabbit was shaped like this. A few thousand years later, it kind of was a little bit shaped like this. I have blind faith that there is a vast power out there governing the laws of the rabbits. Okay? I'm not even a science student, and I can debunk this shit. Despite contradictory indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay it all. What's the mighty purpose and the rhythm? There's something in the sky comes down and tells you got a drinking problem, so you got to sit in a room full of people for the rest of your fucking life, and you got to confess your sins. Otherwise, you believe the universe is going nowhere. Well, I hate to tell you this, Bill, but the meetings, they're going nowhere. They're rushing aimlessly nowhere. I simply had to believe in the spirit of the universe. No, you chose to believe in the spirit of the universe. If you have all of these intellectual heroes who could have presented you absolute sound and logical arguments or scientific evidence for why your ideas are nonsense, then you wouldn't simply have to believe in the universe. Who neither knew time nor limitation. Well, if it doesn't know time or limitation, how do you know about it? But that was as far as I had gone. With ministers in the world religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, who was love, superhuman strength, and direction, I became irritated and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. To Christ I conceded the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claimed him. For myself, I had adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded. Bullshit. Okay, you've already talked over and over again in your early parts of his biography about how he had all these spiritual experiences. So what this sounds like right here in the big book is he's writing the same old testimony that you hear in innumerable evangelical churches all across the country. I was an atheist when I got religion. I hated God. I didn't believe in God. I didn't believe in anything. I didn't care about anything. And then one day there was a bolt of lightning from the sky and it hit me in the head and I went down onto my knees and I said, Jesus, you're there. And it appeared, you get what I'm driving at. In 1938, Bill W. plainly declared that he had never been an atheist, that he always believed in a higher power, a spirit of the universe, and simply disregarded the parts of religion that he found to be distasteful or inconvenient. Funny, Bill has all these moral commandments, but he can ignore the ones that are inconvenient. And in the big book, he describes his behavior before his drug-induced vision of God, like this. At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. There I humbly offered myself to God, as then I understood him to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have my newfound friend take them away a rooted branch. I had not had a drink since. Wait a minute. You can choose your own conception of God, but your God is all preoccupied with sins, and you being nothing, and him being everything, and all this other kind of thing. So you're just literally admitting to following Christianity and putting this word spiritual on it. Radical, bizarre, and twisted spiritual Christianity, but nonetheless, just a twisted version of evangelism. But anyway, all of Bill's stories about him being a hardcore atheistic scientist who was converted into a true believer in God by a miraculous religious or spiritual experience, seeing the God of the preachers in a vision, were really just some more repeat performances of the old standard of the Oxford group. Show routine members sharing these exaggerated stories of their extremely sinful ways before their religious conversion, in order to make their salvation sound much more miraculous and awe-inspiring. The Oxford group slogans were, the more dramatic the saving, the more value the alcoholic has to the group. And interesting, sinners make compelling saints. Bill's story of his religious conversion and great spiritual experience would not have sounded nearly as impressive if he'd have just admitted that he was just another mediocre, non-intellectual flunk-out whose vague, muddled religious beliefs just got sort of changed and rearranged a little bit by some temporary sober guy named Ebby who was recruiting for his newfound cult religion. I think that's a good place to stop here. I'm 33 minutes involved into this one, and gonna read me a subscriber comment here before we go, and it fits right in with this particular topic. The whole concept is bizarre, in my opinion. The idea that a person is qualified to somehow guide and give advice to another person based solely on the fact that they got to the AA program before their sponsee did and have more sober time is just ridiculous. I've seen sponsors that have no job, live in a shack, no car, and mooch off weaker people with over 20 years of sobriety. Most of the time they talk the talk, they don't walk any kind of walk. I could give you 100 examples, but I don't want to type that much. How a person could sit in thousands of meetings and somehow never apply any of the lessons to themselves, I'll never understand. It could be helpful for a short time, but anything over 2 years is start doing damage to the individuals. I've never seen an old-timer that went to meetings on a regular basis, like 2 or 3 meetings a week, that had anything remotely that I wanted. It does something negative to people, and they become arrogant assholes that live a hypocritical lifestyle. Couldn't have said that better myself. Anyway, I guess this is going to be the last video made in the year 2023. I guess I won't see you guys next week. I'll see you next year. Until then.